Okay, let's get started with From Me Too to All of Us, Organizing to End Sexual Violence Without Prisons. Interview by Sarah Jaffe with Mariame Kabaand and Shira Hassan. In These Times, January 2017. Sarah Jaffe says sexual harassment and sexual assault are in the news because of a powerful, famous man. I wanted to start off with a question for both of you who've been doing this work for a while. Do you feel like the public conversation around these people in the media, on social media, or wherever you're hearing it has progressed at all? Does it look different right now from when you began doing this work? Miriam says the conversation's absolutely different from when I first started doing work around sexual assault. I actually started doing anti-sexual assault work on my college campus. This was in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The focus at that point was on the question of date rape on campus, and the conversation revolved mostly around people drinking and then assaulting people. I also came of age before social media. The conversation was very much limited to having talks with your friends. It wasn't this kind of generalized conversation that's not even really a conversation, which is more often a one-way harangue. I assume I might have to look that up. A one-way rant or just venting. True. It really wasn't like that. You had to talk to people you knew. Beyond that, we were talking with folks in support group settings, storytelling and divulging that you had been raped. It wasn't an environment of compulsory confession where we were forced into disclosing that you were a survivor of sexual assault. It didn't feel like we had to premise our conversations on disclosing our experiences before we could actually speak on this in real ways. Yes indeed, am a survivor of sexual assault and violence, but it just felt different at that time. It felt somehow more intimate and less tied to media and social media. I don't know when the movie The Accused came out. I often see that movie in my trajectory of coming into my own and understanding sexual violence. That movie felt like a moment that made sexual violence connect much more with a larger media conversation, but maybe I'm remembering that wrong. And Shira says, I totally remember when that movie came out, and it really did change the conversation. Bless Jodie Foster. I think the conversation has definitely changed. We have the conversation much more publicly. It's a lot different from writing people's names on the bathroom walls, which is what we were doing in the 1990s. Facebook has become the bathroom wall in a way. I think the way that we have the conversation changes. Then I think because it is a much more democratized platform to some degree, different people are in the conversation than used to be. I do think that by and large, the people who are having the conversation are still the same, though. I don't see this conversation happening in the same way about young people in the sex trade, for example. A lot of the young people I know are more street based. The idea of sexual harassment is something that people are thinking about and angry about. Gwyneth Paltrow is not commenting on their experiences. She's commenting on actresses in Hollywood. I don't want to diminish or demean how important those experiences of violence are. At the same time, it is a certain kind of survivor and a certain kind of violence that we are talking about, and I think that part is the same. Let's see. So Jaff continues, one of the things about this big public conversation is that for me, it actually feels more overwhelming. What Miriam called this culture of compulsory confession feels smothering. It just feels like there's nothing we can do. You've been doing work around this for a while and dealing directly with survivors. How do you fight that feeling it's never going to end? Hassan says, there's stories that overwhelm me and stop me in my tracks, but there are also stories of people I love, and there's a face to every story most of the time for me. The feeling of being overwhelmed is something that I counter with action, and I counter with healing. This idea of healing justice, where speaking out is a part of that healing, I feel connected to that as an action, not so much connected to that as a burden. I feel like it's a blessing to be among survivor stories. I don't actually feel overwhelmed by survivor stories. I feel overwhelmed by inaction around survivor stories. For me, and Kaba says, for me, it is the difference between the question of asking, what can I do personally, versus what can we do? When I think of what I can do as an individual person, it feels more overwhelming. It's like, well, a lot of my friends are survivors. A lot of people I care for and love are survivors. I can't personally take responsibility for all of their lives and pain. I can't take all of that on. You can't also just take on everybody's joy either. When I think about it in that kind of individualistic way, it can feel overwhelming, but I worked toward a collective idea of healing and a collective idea of action and organizing. I don't think that the issue we have right now is that we have too many organizers. I think we have too few organizers. And that can also feel super debilitating when there's a lot of hand wringing or a lot of outrage, but without any direction. I think that can feel overwhelming. Since 1988, since I've been in this field, what's kept me going is that the collectivity and seeking to actually understand and to heal and to be part of that healing process with other people. We end up with this story of one survivor who has to come forward and file charges with the police, and then this one perpetrator will be held accountable, but that doesn't work. Oh, and let's see. Let me start over. Jaffe says, we end up with the story of one survivor who has to come forward and file charges with the police, and then that one perpetrator will be held accountable, but that doesn't work, which is very true. And then Kaba says, and it doesn't happen. Exactly. I think that's another aspect of this for people who are counting on a criminal punishment response to this. I understand feeling completely depressed and debilitated because the system doesn't actually know how to hold firm for survivors. It doesn't know how to transform harm that occurs. It is a system that most people don't access, and most survivors still never access for lots of reasons. Because they don't want to, because they've been traumatized in the past by the system, because they don't want the person who harmed them necessarily caught up in the system. There are a million reasons. Because they don't want to be raked over the coals themselves. Because they try to solve problems in the community. When people do access a system, they are screwed over by it, literally in all different kinds of ways. Hassan then continues, not only can't the system do it, but I think our belief that it can is part of why we feel so betrayed. Some of us have let go of that betrayal because we have just stopped trying to get water from a stone. Yep. Frankly, the stone is being thrown at us. So now we're trying to build shelter from the stone and talk to everyone who's coming inside the shelter about what we can do. That, for me, is perhaps why I feel less overwhelmed. It isn't that I don't feel like, wow, we have an unbelievable amount to do, because I do feel that. But I do feel that we have so many more things to try away from the system than with it. What we have begun to create is this shelter together where we really can focus on who's inside the huddle and work with each person who's there in a more meaningful way to move forward. In the wake of these, Jaffe says, in the wake of these Weinstein revelations, one of the things that some people have been talking about is the whisper network. This is the way that women warn each other about certain men in their political circles or in their work circles. Yet these feel inadequate too. They're not particularly accountable for the people making accusations, which is less a problem than the fact that they just end up assuming that it is still our job to avoid perpetrators. Kaba continues, and you can't force someone into being accountable for things they do. That's not possible. People have to take accountability for things that they actually do wrong. They have to decide that this is wrong. They have to say, this is wrong, and I want to be a part of making some sort of amends or repairing this or not doing it again. The question is, what in our culture allows people to do that? What are the structural things that exist? What in our culture encourages people who assault people and harm people to take responsibilities? What I see is almost nothing. That means, for example, people continue to be rewarded when they do bad things to other people or take negative action against people. We are in a situation where people try to argue over semantics. We don't have a sense that people are prepared to say, there is a spectrum of sexual harm. Not everything is rape, yet everything that feels like a violation is harm. We just don't have that within the larger culture that allows for people to feel like they can take any responsibility and that they can be accountable. The other thing is, we do have the threat that if you do admit that you did this, you might be caught up in the criminal punishment system. You might see that the inside of a jail. So your inclination is to deny until the very end. There is just no incentive for you to come clean and be like, I actually did this. Yes, I did rape that person. I did sexually assault them. I did harass them. I did molest them. We are in this adversarial model where you don't admit it, and the person who is actually being placed on trial is the survivor to prove that you actually did this. So I understand within that why people feel like they have to whisper and why survivors often have to take on the weight of actually figuring out how to bring somebody accountability. The incentive structure is set up this way. Jaffe continues, and of course, not all survivors are women. Exactly. This is to me the work that we have to do. We have to make community members understand that understand what sexual harm looks like, what it feels like, why it is unacceptable. We have to make violence unthinkable in our culture. We have to make interpersonal violence unthinkable. That is the place that we have to work from if we're really going to transform this into something where it isn't the survivors or the victims who have to carry the load all the time. Hassan says, I want to add one thing, the history of where those lists come from. Those kinds of lists got started with people in the sex trade, in particular transgender women of color, who started creating bad date sheets. These were informal sheets, literally, that were written down and passed around through the community. We used to photocopy them, copy them down, hand them out with people's physical descriptions, The rest of the world looks at people in the sex trade as completely disposable, but we borrow their tools all the time when we feel disposable. I want to be sure that we recognize the history and legacy of the tools that are being used, how they're being used, and why they are being used before we say that they are not working or important. Because the next thing just has to grow out of that. Wait, hold up. Because the next thing just has to grow. Oh, yeah, I said it right. What is the next thing we're going to do with those lists? We went from the bathroom wall to Facebook. We went from photocopying the sheet with descriptions to passing it around online. We do have the power and capacity to think of what next, but we haven't quite yet. In part, it's because we don't have the solidarity with each other and we don't recognize that the spectrum of sexual violence is something that is happening to all of us. We live in rape culture, and all of this is going to keep happening to us until we can collectively figure out what we are doing here. Kaba continues, as Shira mentioned early on, who are the survivors we are actually uplifting? Who are the people? What is sexual violence? When we put people in prisons and in jails, often we are sentencing them to judicial rape because we know they are going to be assaulted when they go inside. Yet we're still putting people in that environment to be assaulted. How are you going to be an anti-rape advocate or organizer and still be pressing for people to be put into rape factories? We have to complicate this conversation around sexual violence and see all the different ways that it's used as a form of social control across the board with many different people from all genders, all different races, and all different social locations. If we understand the problem in that way, we have a better shot at actually uprooting all of the conditions that lead to this and addressing all of the ways in which sexual violence reinforces other forms of violence. Our work over a couple of decades now has been devoted to complicating narratives that are too easy. These really simple narratives around perfect victims who are assaulted by evil monsters, and that is the end of the story. The kill all rapists conversation, which just kind of flattens what sexual violence really is, that doesn't take into consideration the spectrum of sexual violence, minimize certain people's experiences, and makes other people's experiences more valid. I want to press my concern about the perfect victim narrative, but also challenge the assumption that we all have the same experience because we've been raped, and we all think the same way about how to address it, and that for all of us, being a rape survivor becomes your identity. We were raped. Something bad happened to us. We are trying to address that, but we're not taking on the survivor as a totalizing identity for everything we do in our lives, and that matters. I want more of those kinds of conversations to be happening in public, but somehow we can't have those. We can't have complicated conversations about sexual violence because then you are accused of rape apologia or you are accused of coddling rapists. That is very, very limiting. It means that we're not going to be able to uproot and really solve the problem ultimately. Hassan says, I don't know what is going to happen with Mr. Weinstein, but I know that he has enough money to make what he wants to happen a possibility. The consequences that are going to happen to him, they may never measure up to the harm he created, yet we see wide-scale harm happening for people who may ultimately want to be accountable. Sexual violence is very nuanced, and the system that we have is not. Prison is as not feminist. Prison is as not feminist. I don't get. That is one of Mariame's famous points. Prison isn't feminist because it recreates the same sexual violence and the same fear, the same kinds of oppression. It is the pin on the head of the racist and sexist system that we live in. That does not mean, however, that there should be no consequences. It means real consequences, consequences that really matter. It means transforming the conditions that exist in the first place for this to even have happened. It is really critical for people to think about the difference between punishment and consequences. Punishment often is actually not the same thing as transformation. Even though it feels good to wear the Kill the Rapist t-shirt, that isn't the thing that is actually going to get us the world we want to live in. Okay. Kaba continues, I also want to talk a little bit about what is hopeful about what is happening in the world around these issues. Shira and I just spent 3.5 days in Chicago with 50 people from around the country doing trainings and facilitating discussion and dialogue about how we do community accountability to address sexual harm and interpersonal violence. These folks came together from all over the country and took that much time out of their day because we understand this as a moment of opportunity for something different. A lot of people are talking now, and there is much more awareness around the fact that the prison industrial complex has churned communities and people through a meat grinder, devastating people. Yet people don't feel safer. People don't feel as though violence is curbed in any way. We have to build up the skills of being able to ask questions like, what does it mean to actually center a survivor who is harmed? What does it mean to actually support people who have caused harm? What does it mean to take responsibility for saying we refuse in our community to condone when this happens? One of the things that is so important is that harm causes wounds that necessitate healing. That is what so many people are looking for, a way to begin to heal. How are we going to create in our community spaces that allow people real opportunity to heal? Again, this will not necessarily be accomplished through compulsory confession in a public way, but how do we hold that people who have been harmed deserve an opportunity for that harm to be addressed in a real way? Often, that is all people want, a real acknowledgement that said, I was hurt. Somebody did it. I want them to know that they did it. I want them to see that I want to see that they have some remorse for having done it, and I want them to start a process by which they will ensure themselves at least and be accountable to their community for not doing it again. That is what I'm trying to get as a survivor. I think there is hope in that. Awesome, and very much Black women punished for self-defense must be freed from their cages will be the next one. And that is it for now.